The figure of the knight is certainly one of the most iconic of the medieval era, shrouded in a sort of charm that still persists to this day both in literature and cinema. It should be noted that the medieval knight emerges with all the characteristics that make him familiar to us, following a long process which blends different elements and types of warriors, characterized by both practical and military aspects as well as economic and social ones. Owning a horse with the possibility of using it as a mount in battle was a prerogative of wealthy social classes already in ancient times, including classical antiquity. That is because maintaining an animal that, unlike cattle, pigs and goats, did not have yields in terms of food production was a significant expense. Historically, in Europe, the first to be defined as knights, at least if we want to find a sort of counterpart in Latin, would be the equites, who were members of the bourgeoisie of Republican Rome. These were citizens who did not belong to the noble class, but who had enough money to spend on maintaining a horse with which to go into battle, an element that became distinctive and characterizing. Despite essentially being the rich, or rather the enriched, the term that defines in fact them as a social class is precisely equites, which in English would be translated as horsemen. From a purely functional perspective, it should be noted that cavalry did not play a predominant role in ancient armies. Just like light infantry, cavalry served as support for heavy infantry, which was at this time the true queen of the battlefield. Skillful use of cavalry certainly enabled victories in battles, as demonstrated by strategists such as Alexander the Great and Hannibal, but only when it was employed, like other specialized units such as archers, slingers, skirmishers, in support of rank-and-file infantry. In other words, shock cavalry or heavy cavalry charges are a later development, and we'll get there. So, how did cavalry work exactly in the classical period? Well, very often Western cavalry forces until the 1st century BC behaved as reconnaissance troops, attacking enemies on the flanks or from behind, used to pursue a routing enemy, or were tasked with engaging other cavalry forces, avoiding direct confrontation with heavy infantry and preferring to harass them with javelins, or even acting as mounted infantry who would dismount to fight in battle. An exception to this would be the cavalry of the Macedonian world, whose frontal charges with a long two-handed lance, which were possible precisely because they were executed strategically in concert with the maneuvers of the phalanx infantry. Perhaps not coincidentally, from an ideological perspective, the hetairoi, Alexander the Great's mounted companions, would become one of the inspirational models for the knight of the late Middle Ages. Cavalry started to gain prestige and increase its tactical significance during the Imperial Age because of the invention of the horned saddle, a Gallic model that significantly increased the rider's stability. This is also reflected in Roman art, where the stylistic element of the barbarian being trampled by the horseman becomes a particularly widespread iconography. There were, however, other factors that also contributed to the growing prestige of cavalry as a prominent element on the battlefields throughout the Imperial Age, such as the increasingly frequent recruitment into Roman armies of elements from Eastern Germanic populations, such as the Goths and the Indo-Iranian peoples, the Sarmatians, who were accustomed to fighting on horseback, but also the need to act swiftly along the entire frontier of the limes, or limes, to contain barbarian attacks, in a form of conflict that made mobility and speed essential and invaluable elements. There is, however, another element that must be discussed when talking about cavalry in the Roman period, and that is the adoption of a heavy cavalry model inspired by the Persian world, so-called cataphracts, a word of Greek origins that the Romans would have called in Latin clibanari. These could be considered to some extent the ancestors of heavy cavalry of the Middle Ages. In the transition between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, due to the civil changes taking place in Europe that saw the dismantling of some of the previous structures of the classical world and the re-emergence of social relationship imbalances with an archaic flavor still present in the Germanic world, the figure of the mounted warrior increasingly coincided with the private militia and personal guard of this or that illustrious personality, and the first to fit this description properly were those called bucellari, literally biscuit eaters, named after the bucellatum, the soldier's bread, or hardtack. These were fighters equipped and paid by a noble or a high official to act as their retinue, and, if numbers allowed, even as a personal army, who usually enjoyed superior training. As we continue our journey through the ages, exploring the beginnings and evolutions of the figure of the knight, we could say that the bucellaria are conceptually the foundation for the subsequent mounted fighting units that would establish themselves under the Carolingian world. These knights, who were effectively close to monarchs and nobles thanks to the royal gifts of land holdings called benefices, which they would receive in exchange for their service, eventually became nobility themselves when the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, made these lands hereditary by decree. We could say that by definition, being part of a monarch's or high-ranking noble's retinue, as well as fighting on horseback, are the two elements that would characterize knights in their definition during the early Middle Ages. Now let's have a look at the word knight and its etymology. The Anglo-Saxon world would use the word Knecht to define what was both a new social class and a military corps, while the German world would use Knecht, from which modern English knight derives. Knecht becomes Knecht, Kneicht, Kneit, knight. The original Germanic root has several meanings, from young man, boy, to servant, but should be understood in this latter meaning: someone who serves, who is subordinate, who is bound to someone else, namely the king or a noble. Curiously, we find the term in the name of another type of fighter between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Landsknecht. Land, Knecht, one who serves the land. The French-speaking world would instead use the word chevalier, from cheval, horse, and in Germany Knecht would gradually be abandoned during the late Middle Ages for the form Ritter, person who rides, a rider. The increasingly widespread use of mounted regiments as no longer a support element but as a keystone of armies, and the establishment of a nobility born from the equestrian military sphere led to a selection of animals, which probably already begun in late Roman times, that produced substantial changes in horse sizes. While ancient horses were essentially little larger than ponies, standing between 1 meter 10 and 1 meter 30, targeted crossbreeding with breeds from the east led to the birth of increasingly large and imposing beasts, making the knight much more formidable, both from a practical and psychological point of view. And from a functional perspective, the introduction of the stirrup, probably arriving in Europe with a Mongol origin between the 6th and the 7th century AD, which was adopted by the Franks around the 8th century, must have further contributed to the establishment of the knight as a model warrior, a shock impact factor, although contemporary military historians largely agree that its contribution has been exaggerated by historical literature of the 1960s. It is in fact possible that while the stirrup undoubtedly made horseback riding easier, its use, at least during the early Middle Ages, must not have been as revolutionary as the invention of the horned saddle that we discussed earlier when it comes to the ancient times. At least according to the sources, its primary function seems to have been not so much to maintain stability, but to mount the horse easily, as evidenced by its Latin name, transcribed in Greek characters in the strategikon scala, which means ladder. Yes, the ancients called it a ladder. Now, if we want to look for a specific battle that kind of marks the moment in which cavalry becomes more important in Europe as a main component within military strategy, of course we could think and go all the way back to the Battle of Adrianople, but I think the most fitting example would be indeed the famous Battle of Hastings of 1066. That is because if we look at the Bayeux tapestry, however it's pronounced, when we look at the Saxons and the Normans, sometimes they're almost virtually indistinguishable, and the one thing that sets aside the victorious Normans over the Saxons is the fact that a huge chunk of their troops is in fact mounted. They focus on cavalry. But as we continue a journey deeper within the medieval period, that's when a specific type of technique called la lance couchée, or the idea of putting your lance underneath your armpit, and a stronger focus on impact cavalry will make use, a good 250 years later, of the invention of the stirrup, maximizing its potential. And as we continue into the late Middle Ages with the advent of plate armor, the lance in rest will further strengthen and solidify this fighting technique, maximizing the impact force on the target. As we discuss all of this, one thing that we have to discuss is how effective cavalry charges are against infantry. What's important to say is that cavalry doesn't always trump infantry, and it is in fact a matter of training. With that being said, it is absolutely true that at least until the late 13th century, infantry formations that would be disciplined enough to remain compact in the face of a heavy cavalry charge rarely existed, due to several factors that also involved the psychological sphere. Since the time of the Bucellari, the mounted warrior was well trained. First, because the noble took care of his subsistence, then because he became noble himself, while infantry units of the early medieval period were increasingly made up of poorly armed and unmotivated conscripts. A massive shift when you think about it when compared to the Roman era, very professional and heavily armed infantry units, the citizen infantry. We will not see that level of professionalism all the way up to the modern period. This is a phenomenon that established itself at different times in different areas, but beyond some notable exceptions, usually relating to Northern Europe, see for example the Saxon Huscarls at Hastings, who were infantry but simultaneously elite troops from a high social class, we can increasingly consider it a norm for a fair portion of the Middle Ages. On the contrary, knights were better trained, also because that's what they did. It was their profession. At the same time, they didn't have to go farm the land. They had a lot of time to focus on training, which sculpted their physiques, increased their martial prowess, their effectiveness. Not to mention that due to the fact that they were low nobility, usually a knight would be wealthy, which means he can be better armed, with more effective equipment, which would be, of course, costly and protective. On top of that, being noble meant that they ate better. Nutrition is also an important aspect of the effectiveness of a soldier in battle. They consumed more meat more often, they were therefore on average taller and more robust. A single knight must have appeared on the battlefield as a sort of invincible tank, impervious to blows, and at the same time, deadly. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. The conviction of belonging to a superior social class, if not a superior lineage, is typical of the medieval knights of this era, as this concept develops alongside the birth of chivalric orders that are nothing more than the medieval revival of the warbands of noble warriors from ancient times and the early Middle Ages. Knights were, to some extent, conscious of this element, and it is no coincidence that chivalric narratives refer back to Alexander the Great's companions, the mythical knights of King Arthur and the Round Table, and, of course, Charlemagne's paladins. It is, however, also important to underline that oftentimes when we say men-at-arms, even though we imagine, once again, low-level, low-tier, improvised infantry units that are poor and can just pick up a couple of spears, maybe there is a billman, maybe a helmet, perhaps a piece of mail underneath or on top of their gambeson. Some men-at-arms actually fought in the manner of the knight, and they are in fact virtually indistinguishable from mounted nobility. And whenever we look at iconography, it's not that easy to know which of these heavily armored knights is actually knighted and which is a veteran, successful man-at-arms. The chivalric orders of the late Middle Ages formed by progressively incorporating various elements tied to religious narratives, and when they didn't go as far as to present themselves as genuine armed monastic and priestly orders, as a member of the upper class, the knight must also embody superior ideals, which in the Middle Ages could only be inextricably interconnected with Christianity. Themes of faith, such as the search of the Holy Grail or the defense of innocent from pagans, would prove functional to the growing opposition between the Christian West and the pagan Baltic world, but even more so with the Muslim East and Spain. Alright noble ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video on the origins, development and evolution of the concept of the medieval knight. This should be considered as an introductory, surface level discussion, but if you're interested in this topic, do let me know in the comments below and leave a comment, and I will continue to make episodes when we will further focus on areas where, together with the reading of sources, we can develop a more cohesive and deeper discussion. But for today, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye. Proudly presenting the pendant of the noble one. Look at this beauty. Original custom design created by me in collaboration with Viking Jewelry. And it's my way to celebrate all of you, because as you know, I've been calling you noble ones for the last 12 years. Well, this is indeed the pendant of you, the noble ones, who are the custos veritatis, written here in Latin, and it means keeper of truth, because that's the only thing that matters. The truth, whether it offends them or not. So, available in both silver and bronze. I think my favorite is the bronze one, but they're both great. And this can be bought as a set, as we offer the original ring of the noble one, available in silver, bronze, and gold, the bracelet of the noble one, silent oath of truth, and a more low-profile version of the ring for those who prefer something a little thinner, which we offer also in bronze, silver, 14-karat gold, and 18-karat gold. Use the code NOBLE1 for a 15% discount at checkout, and massive thanks to each and every single one of you, and thank you to my haters for supporting my work.